Close your eyes for just a second. I want you to go somewhere with me. It is a Saturday afternoon in 1955, somewhere in the American South. The screen door is shut but not latched, and every now and then the warm air pushes it open just a crack, just enough to let in the sound of the neighbor's lawnmower 2 houses down. The radio in the front room is playing something low. And coming from the kitchen, coming through every wall in that house, seeping under every door, curling up the staircase and finding you no matter where you tried to hide, is a smell that does not exist anymore. Not like that. Not in that particular combination of rendered fat and wood smoke and cast iron and something sweet underneath it all that you could never quite name. That smell had an author. She was standing at the stove with her back to you and a dish towel tucked into her apron, and she was doing things that no cookbook had ever sanctioned, things that no home economics teacher at the colored school had ever put on a chalkboard, things that would make a modern nutritionist close their eyes and count slowly to 10. And the food she was making, the food coming out of that kitchen, it was the best food you ever put in your mouth. Bar none. Nothing before and nothing since has come within a country mile of what came out of that woman's kitchen. And here's what I want you to understand. She wasn't lucky. She wasn't guessing. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had a system. She had shortcuts. She had methods that the women before her had handed down like heirlooms, little secrets, little tricks, little pieces of kitchen wisdom that were technically against every rule anybody had ever written down, and that is precisely why they worked so beautifully. Today, family, we are pulling back the curtain on 25 of them. Hey, family, I'm James, and today we're going back to 1955, back to the kitchens that built us, back to the women who could make something out of nothing and make it taste like heaven. These are the shortcuts, the workarounds, the unwritten rules that Granny used every single day, and that nobody talks about anymore. Now, before we get into it, if you're new here, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. We are building a community of folks who remember. Folks who want to pass this down before it disappears completely. Hit subscribe, ring that bell, and let's get into it. Because Granny is waiting on us. Number 1. Starting the grease before anything else was even decided. Now in a modern kitchen, you heat the pan after you know what you're cooking. You decide the dish, you get out the ingredients, you think about it, then you turn on the heat. Granny did not operate this way. In 1955, when Big Mama walked into that kitchen in the morning, the very first thing she did, before she opened a single cabinet, before she looked in the icebox, before she had made one decision about what the day's meals were going to be, was put her cast iron skillet on the burner and drop in a spoon of lard. Just a spoon, enough to get things going. Because in her world, a cold skillet was a wasted skillet. The heat was always running in that kitchen. Always. She said a warm pan was a ready pan, and a ready pan meant you were never starting from scratch. She'd start the grease, then figure out what it was going to cook. That is backwards by every modern standard, and that is exactly why her food had that flavor yours doesn't. Number 2. Bacon grease as the universal answer to every question. If you opened the cabinet next to Granny's stove in 1955, the first thing you would find, sitting right there in plain sight, not hidden, not refrigerated, just sitting in an old tin can or a ceramic crock with a lid, was the bacon grease jar. And that jar was not decoration. That jar was the most important ingredient in her entire kitchen. She saved every drop of grease from every strip of bacon she ever cooked. She saved it the way other people saved money. And she used it on everything. Greens, cornbread, beans, biscuits. She put it in cast iron before she fried chicken. She put a spoon of it in her potato salad when nobody was looking. She'd rub it on the outside of a sweet potato before it went in the oven. That bacon grease jar was the secret handshake of black cooking in 1955, and every grandmother you ever knew had one. The nutritionists today would lock her up, but they have also never tasted her cornbread, and they never will. Number 3. Seasoning the water. Child, let me tell you something that people have forgotten. Granny did not boil a pot of water without putting something in it. Not once, not for pasta, not for vegetables, not for anything. That water was going to work, Before it even started bubbling, she had already added salt. Real salt. More than the recipe said, more than you would dare to put in today. And depending on what she was cooking, she might add a piece of fatback, or a bay leaf she had been drying on the windowsill since August, or a cut of onion with the skin still on it. She understood something that takes culinary school students 3 semesters to learn. Flavor does not start when the food hits the water. Flavor starts with the water itself. She was building the foundation before she laid the first brick, and she did it without a single lesson from anybody. That was just how it was done. Number 4. The 2-day pot of beans. Now this one is going to require you to slow down and pay attention, because people rush this now and they wonder why their beans don't taste right. In 1955, when Granny started a pot of pinto beans or navy beans or butter beans, she was not making a 1-day project. That pot had a timeline. Day 1. The beans went into a bowl of cold water in the evening to soak overnight. Not for an hour, not for a few hours, overnight, through the night. She'd set them before she went to bed, and they'd be there in the morning, swollen and ready. Day 2. She'd drain that water, fill the pot fresh, add her ham hock or her neck bone or whatever piece of pork she happened to have, and she would cook those beans low and slow for most of the day. Not boiling hard, simmering, a soft bubble, patient. She'd season at the end, never at the beginning, because she said salt too early made the beans tough. She was right about that. Every food scientist alive today agrees she was right about that. She knew it in 1955 without a single experiment. She knew it because her mother had told her. Number 5. Lard in the biscuit, not butter. Every biscuit recipe today calls for butter. Cold butter, cubed, cut into the flour with a pastry cutter or 2 knives or whatever modern instrument the cookbook recommends. Granny did not own a pastry cutter. She had her hands. And she did not use butter in her biscuits. She used lard. Pure white, rendered lard, kept in a bucket in the cool part of the kitchen, and she would scoop out a big spoon of it and cut it into her flour with her fingers, pinching and rubbing until the mixture looked like coarse sand. That technique, hands instead of tools, lard instead of butter, produced a biscuit with a flaky, layered interior and a crust that shattered when you broke it. A butter biscuit is soft. A lard biscuit is an event. Folks don't do this anymore, and that is a shame. Number 6. Never washing the cast iron with soap. This one made the health department nervous, and Granny did not care one bit. She cleaned her cast iron skillet the way her grandmother had taught her, with hot water and a stiff brush, never with dish soap, and then she would dry it on the burner over low heat and wipe it down with a thin layer of lard before putting it away. She would look at you like you had lost your mind if you suggested soap. Soap strips the seasoning, she would say. The seasoning on a well-kept cast iron is built up over years, sometimes over decades, of cooking in it, oiling it, heating it. It is a layer of polymerized fat that is essentially a natural non-stick surface that gets better with time. Granny's cast iron was 30 years old. Some of it had come from her own mother. That pan had cooked more meals than you could count, and it had never been touched by soap, and the food that came out of it had a depth of flavor that no new pan out of a box has ever matched. That seasoning was an heirloom. It was the taste of every meal that came before. Number 7. Hot sauce in the pot, not on the plate. Now when you think about hot sauce and black cooking, most people think about the bottle on the table. You put it on your food at the table. You control how much heat you want. That is the modern approach. But Granny in 1955 did not wait for the table. She put the hot sauce in the pot while things were cooking. Not a lot. Just a splash. Just enough to wake everything else up. She had a bottle of Louisiana hot sauce, the kind with the red label that cost about 15 cents in 1955. And she would shake 3 or 4 drops into her greens, into her beans, into her stew, while it was still on the stove, while the heat could cook the raw edge off the vinegar and leave behind just the warmth and the depth. What you tasted on the plate was not hot sauce. What you tasted was something you couldn't identify, something that made everything taste more like itself. That's the shortcut right there. Number 8. pork in everything. Now this one is not subtle, and Granny was not trying to hide it. In 1955, pork was the seasoning. It was not a main dish. It was not even a side dish. It was the background note in almost every savory thing that came out of that kitchen. Not a big piece of it. Just enough. A ham hock in the beans. A piece of fatback in the greens. Smoked neck bones in the cabbage. A sliced piece of salt pork in the field peas. She was using pork the way a French chef uses butter. Not for the meat itself, but for the fat and the smoke and the salt and the animal richness it added to everything it touched. And her greens. Lord have mercy, her greens. They were not greens with a piece of meat in them. They were pork-flavored greens. Every leaf had absorbed it. Every bite had it. That is a flavor you cannot replicate with olive oil and vegetable broth, and I want to be very clear about that. Now, before we keep going, family, I need to stop right here and ask you something. Because I know there is somebody watching this right now whose grandmother had a kitchen technique that I have not mentioned yet. Something specific. Something that was hers. Maybe it was something she put in the pot that nobody else would have thought to put there. Maybe it was the way she handled a particular dish, or the order she did things, or something she said while she was cooking. I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments right now. Tell me Granny's name and tell me her trick. Let's give these women their flowers right here in the comments section, because the things they knew deserve to be remembered out loud. Number 9. Day-old cornbread in the dressing. Here is a truth that Thanksgiving tables have been quietly living by for 100 years, but that nobody says directly. The cornbread you use for cornbread dressing is never fresh. Never. In Granny's kitchen, making dressing required planning ahead by at least a day. She would bake a skillet of cornbread the evening before Thanksgiving and leave it uncovered on the counter overnight. Not to dry out by accident. On purpose. Dry, slightly stale cornbread absorbs the broth better. It holds its texture through the baking. Fresh cornbread turns to mush. She knew this the way she knew her own name, and she planned her cooking schedule around it. And the dressing that came out of her oven was something people talked about the way they talked about church. It was sacred. It required ritual. And one of those rituals was the day-old cornbread, sitting on the counter the night before, waiting to do its work. Number 10. Pressing the biscuit dough, not rolling it. A rolling pin is a fine tool. Granny owned one and used it for other things, but for biscuits, she did not roll the dough, she pressed it. She would flour her hands, flour the top of that dough, and press it out with her palms, patting it to an even thickness the way you'd pat down a sleeping baby's blanket. The reason was simple, and she never had to explain it. A rolling pin pushes the air out. Her hands didn't. Pressed biscuits had more lift. They had more layers. They had that open, pillowy interior that rolled biscuits never quite achieved. And she cut them not with a biscuit cutter, but with the rim of a glass. A jelly jar, usually. The one that had been emptied during the week and washed and set to the side because she already knew what it was going to be used for. That glass left a clean edge that didn't compress the sides, and compressed sides mean a biscuit that doesn't rise evenly. She had figured out all of this without a culinary degree. She had figured it out by doing it wrong once and not doing it wrong again. Number 11. The overnight marinade in a paper bag. This one is going to sound unusual, and I promise you it was real. When Granny was fixing to fry chicken, her preparation started the night before, and it did not involve a Ziploc bag because those did not exist in 1955. It involved a brown paper bag. She would put her cut chicken pieces in a bowl of cold salted water overnight. Some people used buttermilk, and we will get to that. And then the next morning she would drain the chicken, shake her seasoned flour into a dry paper bag, drop the chicken pieces in, fold the top of the bag over and shake. Hard. That bag got every piece of chicken coated evenly. Sides, corners, joints, everything, in a way that a plate of flour never could. The coating was thorough and it stayed on. And there was something about the paper absorbing the excess moisture from the chicken that made the crust form better in the hot grease. You can buy a dedicated chicken frying contraption today for $40 that does not do what that paper bag did for free. Number 12. Buttermilk as the brine. buttermilk as... Back in those days, buttermilk was not a baking ingredient. It was the liquid you soaked things in. Granny would put her chicken in a bowl of buttermilk the night before she fried it. Sometimes she'd add hot sauce to that buttermilk, sometimes a pinch of garlic powder. And the chicken would sit in that bath overnight. And what would happen is a gentle tenderizing. The acid in the buttermilk slowly breaking down the muscle fibers, making everything more yielding, more receptive to the seasoning that would go on later. Chicken soaked in buttermilk does not taste like buttermilk when it's done. It tastes like the best version of chicken, juicier, more tender, more deeply flavored. She could not have told you the chemistry behind it, but she understood the result, and she had been producing that result every single week for 30 years. You won't see that today, not in the same way. Number 13. Onions as the flavor foundation for everything. There was a particular sound in a black kitchen in 1955 that meant things were about to get serious. It was the sound of onions hitting a hot, greased pan. That high, sizzling hiss that softens within about 30 seconds into a lower, more intimate bubbling. In Granny's kitchen, that sound was the beginning of almost every savory dish, not as a component, as a foundation. She did not add onion to things. She started with onion and built on top of it. And the onion she used was never perfectly diced, because she was not a restaurant chef. She was a grandmother cooking for 8 people before noon on a Sunday, and she chopped those onions the way she chopped them, which was imperfectly and efficiently, and well. What mattered was that they went in first. What mattered was that they had time to soften and caramelize in that grease, 10, 15 minutes of patient stirring, before anything else joined them. That slow-cooked onion base was the reason everything that came after tasted like it was supposed to taste. It was the first word in the sentence. Number 14. Cooking greens in pot liquor from the day before. Now here is a level of kitchen planning that requires a certain kind of mind. Granny understood that pot liquor, the dark, richly seasoned liquid left in the pot after you've cooked down a batch of collard greens or turnip greens, was not waste. It was not dishwater. It was a concentrated broth that had absorbed hours of pork fat and vegetable bitterness and salt and smoke, and it was worth more than the greens themselves by the time they were done. She saved it. In a mason jar, in the icebox, and when she cooked the next batch of greens, she would use that pot liquor instead of plain water. So the second pot of greens was cooked in the flavor of the first pot of greens, and the third pot was richer still. It was a layering of flavor across days, across weeks, across the whole long trajectory of a woman who cooked nearly every meal her family ate and who wasted nothing, nothing, nothing. Number 15, the low and slow rule on everything that could be hurried. Here is the thing about 1955 that is different from every kitchen today. Nobody in 1955 was optimizing for speed the way we do now. Not in a black Southern kitchen. Not when the woman at the stove had been cooking since sunup and expected to be cooking until the family sat down, and she had no interest in rushing a process that was going to feed people she loved. Granny cooked everything that could stand it on low heat for a long time. Her beans were on the stove for 4, 5, 6 hours. Her greens cooked for 2 hours at a minimum. Her stew went into the pot after breakfast and came out at dinner. This was not inefficiency. This was wisdom. Long, slow cooking breaks down connective tissue in meat and makes it tender. It concentrates flavors. It develops complexity. The shortcut, paradoxically, was refusing to take the shortcut. She fed people food that had been allowed to become what it was always meant to be. That is something you cannot rush. Number 16. Flour as a thickener, stirred in cold water first. Granny did not own a container of cornstarch in 1955. If she needed to thicken a gravy or a soup or a stew, she used flour, and she used it the way she had been taught. She would shake 2 or 3 tablespoons of plain flour into a tin cup or a small mason jar, add cold water, and stir it until it was completely smooth. No lumps before it ever went near the hot pot. Then she'd pour that slurry slowly into whatever was simmering, stirring constantly. The cold water step was everything. Flour poured directly into a hot liquid lumps immediately, but flour dispersed in cold water first goes in smooth. Every time. She stirred her gravies to a velvet consistency without a single lump, and she did it with a fork and a tin cup and 30 seconds of preparation, and the gravy that came out was poured over biscuits and consumed by people who never once thought about the technique behind it. They just knew it was perfect. Number 17. The baking powder biscuit insurance policy. Now this one is subtle. Pay attention. When Granny made biscuits, she used self-rising flour. That was the standard in a southern kitchen in 1955. White Lily self-rising flour, if she could get it, the bag with the white and red label. But here is what she did that the bag did not instruct her to do. She added a small, additional pinch of baking powder anyway, over and above what the self-rising flour already contained. Because she had learned, through experience, through batches that didn't rise as high as she wanted, that self-rising flour didn't always perform equally. Different bags, different ages, different humidity levels in the kitchen all affected the leavening. So she insured against all of it with that extra pinch. She didn't measure it. She knew it by feel, by the size of the pinch, by how her hand moved. And her biscuits rose with a reliability that seemed almost supernatural to the people eating them. It was not supernatural. It was insurance. She was managing risk in her kitchen the same way a careful woman manages risk in everything else she tends to. Now we are getting into the part of this list, family, where the shortcuts stop being about convenience and start being about something deeper. The next several items are not tricks. They are the philosophy underneath the tricks. So stay with me here. Number 18. Cooking for 2 meals at once without telling anyone. In a black household in 1955, with a family of 6 or 8 to feed and a food budget that did not allow for waste of any kind, Granny had developed a practice that she never announced and never explained, but executed every single day. She cooked more than one meal at the same time, using the same heat and the same pots. The roast that went in the oven for Sunday dinner would produce drippings that became Monday's gravy. The ham hocks that seasoned Sunday's beans would come out of the pot, get pulled off the bone, and go into Tuesday's hash. The leftover cornbread from Sunday's table became Wednesday's dressing when she added eggs and broth and baked it again. She was not cooking a meal, she was cooking a week. And every component served double duty, sometimes triple duty, and nothing went to waste. Child, let me tell you something. That was not poverty cooking. That was mastery. Number 19. The skillet gravy built from the pan drippings. After Granny fried her chicken, she did not rinse the skillet. She did not set it aside. She stood right there at that stove with that cast iron full of browned bits and rendered fat, and she made gravy in the same pan right then, while everything was still hot. She'd pour off most of the grease, leave about 3 tablespoons behind, along with all those dark, caramelized bits stuck to the bottom, the bits she called the good part, and she'd sprinkle in her flour and stir it into the fat until it turned the color of a pecan shell. Then she'd pour in her milk, slowly, stirring with a wooden spoon, and she would deglaze all those dark bits from the bottom of the pan as she went. That gravy had the entire story of the fried chicken in it. Every drop of flavor that had seeped out during the frying was still in that pan, and she had captured all of it and turned it into something you poured over everything. The pan was not a used pan. The pan was a second meal. Number 20. Using the stale bread before it could go to waste. This right here, this is something we need to bring back. In Granny's kitchen, there was no such thing as throwing away bread. Not a heel of white bread, not a biscuit left from breakfast, not a piece of cornbread from the night before. Stale bread had purposes. It went into a bowl with eggs and milk and became bread pudding, sweetened with whatever sugar she had, flavored with vanilla, or with nutmeg scraped from the whole pod she kept in her spice drawer. It went into a skillet with butter and bacon grease and became fried toast. It was crumbled into a pot of beans for thickness. It was cubed and dried in the oven and became the base for dressing. Bread in Granny's house did not expire. It transformed. That was not frugality for frugality's sake. That was the mind of a woman who had seen hard times and knew that waste was a luxury she could not afford, and a habit she refused to develop even when times got easier. Number 21. Vinegar as the secret in the greens. Now, most people know that Granny puts something acidic in her greens. Most people know about the hot sauce, and we talked about that. But the one people don't always know about is the splash of apple cider vinegar that went in toward the end. Not at the beginning, not in the middle. At the end, maybe 20 minutes before the greens came off the stove. And the amount was small. You're not talking about making the greens taste sour. You are talking about a tablespoon, maybe 2, that brightened every flavor in that pot. That cut through the richness of the pork and the slight bitterness of the greens and woke everything up. Acid does that. It lifts. It clarifies. It makes everything taste more like itself, while also making it taste better than itself. She couldn't have explained the chemistry, but she could see the result in the faces of the people at her table, and that was explanation enough. That was her laboratory result right there. Number 22. Crisco in the sweet potato pie, not butter. This one is going to cause a little controversy, and I want you to hear me out. For the pie crust family, not the filling, for the crust. In 1955, Granny's pie crust was made with Crisco, not butter, and it produced a crust that was tender and flaky and did not shrink in the pie plate the way an all-butter crust tends to do. Crisco, which had been on the market since 1911, was the modern shortening of the era, marketed specifically as a cleaner, easier alternative to lard for people who wanted a consistent result. Now Granny still used lard for her biscuits because she trusted lard for biscuits. But for her pies, especially her sweet potato pie, that sweet, orange-fleshed, cinnamon and nutmeg-spiced filling that was not a pumpkin pie and was never going to be a pumpkin pie no matter what anybody said. For that pie, the Crisco crust held everything in place without overpowering the delicate sweetness of the filling. That pie was the crown of her kitchen, and the crust was part of why. Number 23. Letting the meat come to room temperature before it hit the heat. This is a technique that professional chefs teach today as if they invented it, and Granny was doing it in 1955 without knowing the word for it. When she was going to fry chicken or cook a pork chop or put a roast in the oven, she took the meat out of the icebox 30 minutes to an hour before it was going to cook. She'd set it on the counter, maybe on a plate, just resting, coming up to room temperature. And the reason this matters, the reason the food scientists can explain today and Granny knew empirically, is that cold meat dropped into hot fat or put into a hot oven creates an uneven cooking process. The outside is done before the inside has even gotten warm. Room temperature meat cooks more evenly, more consistently. You get the outside properly seared and the inside properly cooked through without the outside getting too far ahead. She did not know the phrase thermal equilibration. She just knew that the meat needed to rest before it worked, same as everything else. Number 24. The prayer before she seasoned. Now I said 25 shortcuts, and you may be wondering why I am putting this one near the end instead of setting it aside. I am putting it here because it was a shortcut, not in the way the others were shortcuts. But Granny believed, and I mean truly believed, down to the soles of her feet, that the state of mind in which you cooked a meal affected the way the meal turned out. She was not being superstitious. She was being practical about something that modern psychology has spent decades trying to explain. That focused, intentional, unhurried work produces better results than distracted, rushed, resentful work. Before she seasoned a pot, she would stand still for a moment. Sometimes she would close her eyes. She had already prayed at the table, and she had already prayed in the morning. But this was a different kind of prayer. This was her just settling herself into what she was doing, getting quiet, being present. She seasoned from that place of quiet, and she tasted from that place of quiet. And I believe with everything in me that is why her food tasted the way it tasted. She was not hurrying through feeding people she loved. She was attending to it. Number 25. Cooking by love. I have saved this one for last, family, because it is the most important one and the one you can least afford to dismiss. Granny did not follow a recipe. Not the way we mean the word today. She did not measure in teaspoons and cups with any particular fidelity. She measured in handfuls and pinches and splashes and until it looks right. She tasted as she went, adjusting by feel. And the adjustments she made were not made according to a written standard. They were made according to who was eating. If her grandbaby was coming to dinner and that grandbaby loved a little extra sweetness in the cornbread got a little extra sweetness. If her husband had been working in the heat all week and she knew his body needed something rich and fortifying, the beans got the bigger ham hock. If company was coming, everything went up a level, not to impress them, but because hospitality was a form of love, and love in her world was expressed in detail, in fullness. In the extra spoon of this, and the little bit more of that. This is the shortcut that shortcuts everything else. Cook for someone. Not for a recipe. Not for a food photograph. Not for a standard. For a person. For people. With their preferences and their needs and their histories in mind. That is what Granny did every day of her cooking life. And that is why the food that came out of her kitchen was not merely nourishment. It was love, made edible. Back in those days, the kitchen was not a room in the house. It was the heart of the house, the place where everything got sorted out, where the family came back together after whatever the week had done to them, where the smell that greeted you when you walked through the door told you that someone had been thinking about you before you arrived. We have lost that. Not because we don't love our families, we do. But we have gotten so far away from the kitchen, from the slow cooking and the hot grease and the pot of beans that started yesterday evening. We have gotten so far from all of that the generations coming up behind us don't even know what they're missing. They have never stood in a room full of that smell. They have never pulled up a chair to that table. And that, family, is the real reason I'm here. I am not here to tell you how to cook. I'm here to remind you what cooking was, what it meant, what it carried, and maybe, just maybe, the next time you walk into your kitchen, you'll put on a pot of something slow. You'll save your grease. You'll season your water and let your meat rest and cook for somebody, the way she used to, the way they all used to. Because that flavor you've been chasing your whole life trying to get back to, trying to recreate, it's not in a recipe. It's in the intention. It's in the care. It's in the love that Granny put into every single pot she ever put on that stove. I'll see you next time, family.